Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to this Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is indeed Bill O'Brien, and it is a pleasure to be with you. I apologize for missing yesterday. We were on the road coming back from New England and got in last night. And actually was very close to not being on the air today because my wife was having some car problems this morning. I had to go out and meet her. So I wasn't sure I was going to get back in time, but I did. So I'm thrilled to be here and determined as all get out that I will be here tomorrow as well. So welcome to the Virtual Center. It's been a while. It's been a week almost since maybe it has been a week since we were last together. I believe it was last Wednesday. So it is a pleasure to be with you, and I really, really mean that. A little bit rusty, so please hang in there with me. I don't anticipate that everything will be as smooth as I like to see it. It's never quite as good as I would like to see it. But today, having been off for a while, it might be a little bit bumpier. But in the meantime, I understand from Bob in our chat before we went on the air today that he's made some adjustments and some equipment changes, and we're good to go. We've got the phone lines up and running, and everything seems to be working quite well. So please take advantage of the opportunity to share your thoughts and your ideas with us here at the Virtual Center. We would love to hear from you. I know I would love to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. If you're a little bit reluctant to go on the air, but you'd like to drop me an email and share your thoughts with me personally, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, that's all lowercase, one word, 906@gmail.com. And once again, I do encourage you to take advantage of our Facebook page. If you are a regular user of Facebook and you go to the homepage, in the search box, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will have access to our Facebook page. I will let you know that since I've been out of town now for 5 days, I haven't put anything new on the Facebook page. Usually, Facebook sends you a notice and says, we haven't heard from you in quite a while, you know. And I haven't received that Facebook message yet, but I expect it pretty soon. But on the other hand, I expect to be putting something on Facebook, if not after we finish our program today, then sometime in the AM tomorrow. But again, I do encourage you to go to the Facebook page. There's quite a bit there. I've actually taken to using it almost as a blog, as an opportunity to throw out my ideas and my opinions on some of the contemporary issues of the day, things that those that I have friends, some of my friends, so to speak, real friends, close friends and family, have made a comment that I seem to have an awful lot of friends on Facebook. And of course, that the fact of the matter is I do. I have quite a few friends because I wanted to kind of spread or extend the visibility of this program and to attract as many listeners as we could. And I do believe the Facebook page has done that. I don't have any idea quite how many, but I still get notices from Facebook each day that there's been a new view or 3 new views or 1 new like or things like that. So I know that people continue to find the Facebook page for the first time and react to it, and that's really good. But I want you to know that the opportunity for you to react is there as well. The what's on the Facebook page obviously is my opinion on some issues and some things. I do try to include as much substantive material as possible. In other words, I'm not just rattling my head, so to speak, and throwing up unsupported opinions out there. If I do give you an opinion or put an opinion on Facebook, I feel the necessity to back it up with some substantive information or reasons, if not hard evidence, to support the position that I do take on that particular issue. And of course, as we move toward the summer conventions in July, and then we'll be in the home stretch, which will be the final push towards the November 8th elections. I anticipate more and more opportunities to present themselves of putting things on Facebook and throwing out ideas and suggestions or whatever. I just a comment before we get into anything substantive on today's program. Today is Tuesday, of course, and we did begin 1/2 hour later as we usually do on Tuesdays. So what that will mean is that we will not have our regular break at the between hours. We'll just continue the program right through to the end at the top of the 3 o'clock at 3 o'clock, the top of the hour, so to speak. So, I'm like you. I've been trying to follow some of the events and issues related to this campaign, which is, I think it's already exhausted all the adjectives. Never been anything like it, and blah, 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 and on and on and on. There's absolutely no question that the tone of the campaign is just about, people for years have been talking about negative campaigning, but all of that was just a warm-up to this. This is now, the big news now is the extent to which Donald Trump is resurrecting all of the Clinton scandals of the 90s, the suicide death of Foster, if you remember that, and many of the other things. And it was interesting because I saw this morning an excerpt where Donald Trump himself was apologizing for the negative tone of the campaign, but of course his argument is that he has to play the way people play with him. And since they're raising issues about him, he feels that he needs to reciprocate in kind by raising issues about them. And of course, the fact of the matter is some of these issues, especially since the Clinton scandals of the 90s, obviously related to the Monica Lewinsky affair and Ken Starr and all of that stuff, involved Bill Clinton and only indirectly Hillary. But Donald Trump has put a spin on it that she was the enabler in this whole escapade, and she just supported his lack of being guilty and attacked the accuser and attacked the victim and all of those things. So, and of course, the reality of the situation is, as I think everybody recognizes, as long as the campaign focuses on these issues, it doesn't focus on the real issues. And it's really interesting because Hillary's campaign is claiming that the Hillary Clinton campaign is saying that they refuse to respond and to go into the dirt on this kind of campaigning, that their primary concern is the issues. Fact of the matter is there cannot be a debate unless there are two sides. And as long as Donald Trump is raising these issues, then the other issues related to the economy, related to social programs, related to jobs, infrastructure repair, and many of the other things that we need, ISIS and foreign policy priorities and all of it, are not addressed. So in a sense, there really is a campaign strategy at work here. I think everybody sees it, but to be honest with you, I don't know that anybody's going to be able to figure out a way to deal with it. As we know, Donald Trump went through 17 different opponents through the primary process, and none of them, even though many of them thought that they could deal with this, fact of the matter is he's the only one left standing. So obviously, none of them were able to come up with a strategy to combat this. The Donald is a master at the use of the media and his ability to manipulate news, manipulate the news cycle, obviously make sure that he is the lead item on every morning's news. And on we go. So there's something else that I picked this up, and I can't really give you a source because I can't. I've listened to some, and while we were traveling, I was listening to sources, and then I've been continued to read as well. So I can't really particularly identify the source where I picked this up. It's not mine, but I thought it was really worth mention. And it's the fact that one of Hillary's number one priorities right now is to find a way to bring the Democratic Party together and to win over the supporters of Bernie Sanders. And, of course, in order to do that, it would help a lot, will help a lot, if Bernie Sanders is willing to go along with her and work toward that end. But as we know, Bernie Sanders is claiming the right, and indeed he does have the right, to go as far as he can go in the campaign. He is campaigning hard in California for the June 7th primary there and hoping to win it. And, of course, a win in California, given the number of delegates at issue, going into the convention would be a significant factor in the convention. It would definitely enhance Bernie Sanders' role at the convention, his ability to affect the platform, the party platform, all of it. So he is going on, and of course Hillary is trying to concentrate on Donald Trump, but at the same time she absolutely can't seem to shake or get rid of Bernie Sanders. So we're into that. All right, now the point that I was going to make, because with that background. One of the commentators made the point that the negative campaigning that Donald Trump is engaged in right now, the attacks on Hillary, are in large part not aimed specifically at the fall election so much as they are aimed at supporters of Bernie Sanders. That many of the Sanders supporters tend to be very idealistic young people. And these are the people who would be horrified and are horrified at some of the issues and events associated with the 90s. Many of them were so young that they don't remember these things, as many of us do. And so the thinking of this particular commentator was that this whole strategy of Donald Trump's right now may be designed to make it more difficult for Hillary to pick up support from the Sanders campaign. And if you think about that, it makes some sense. And we know, and if we don't know by now, we should, that Donald Trump is the ultimate manipulator. He's the ultimate strategist. He has an agenda. There's a reason for everything, it seems. And so given that, this idea of this being his way to make it difficult for Hillary Clinton to pick up the support from the Bernie Sanders campaign, it seems to me, is very, very, potentially very, very significant. And I think it's something that we should definitely keep our eye on. But again, I don't think there's any difficulty keeping our eye on it because the media makes sure that it's in front of us all the time. So anyway, I just wanted to make that comment because I think it warrants some thought and some attention. Donald Trump is out to win this campaign, and he's going to try to win it. And of course, the polls are showing that he's closed the gap with Hillary Clinton, and in fact, in a couple of polls, has actually gone a couple of points ahead of her. What they're saying right now, that statistically, the election seems to be, between the two of them, would seem to be a toss-up. And of course, that will change as we move through the summer. So again, I would call your attention to that. But mostly, I would like to get back into some of the issues that really define the virtual center and the kind of programming and the kind of issues we've dealt with. And I thought, in thinking about today's program after being gone for a while, that it might be a good idea to touch on a couple of the issues that we dealt with in our last program, mainly for refresher purposes as much as anything else. You'll recall that in our last program, if you were with us, we dealt, I had put, in fact, I think this may be the last posting that I put on Facebook. We dealt with the issues of the Obama administration and the Obama administration's inability to get anything through a hostile Congress. And we talked a little bit about Mitch McConnell and all the rest of it. But mainly what I was focusing on, and I wanted to emphasize on our program, was the extent to which McConnell and some of the supporters of the majority in the Senate, in the United States Senate, that are responsible for blocking President Obama's nomination to the Supreme Court, nominee to the Supreme Court from having a hearing, and many other things as well. Many people have focused on the president's inability to get anything done and the extent to which, by definition, individual freedom, this is the conservative argument, has been a major argument all along, is that the bigger and more aggressive and more visible and more active government is, the more individual liberty is in jeopardy. The assumption or the idea that there is an inverse proportion between individual freedom, liberty, and the size and activity of government itself. And it goes all the way back to the 18th century, 17th and 18th century idea of the basic hostility, if you will, between individual freedom on the one hand and the power of government on the other. And what we've done and what we did in our last program, as I recall, was to look back, as we frequently do, to the founding period and remind ourselves of what the founders believed about this whole issue of individual liberty. And, of course, what we find in the Federalist Papers is example after example, both in Madison and in Hamilton, of their argument in opposition to this negative idea or the negative idea of government power and its impact on individual freedom. In fact, you'll recall that Hamilton makes the point in more than one of the Federalist Papers that individual liberty is dependent upon and is a product of an aggressive, visible, assertive government. That government being active in the public interest is the best defense there is of individual liberty, rather than being a threat to it. We cited that with Madison as well, that both of these people argue that the entire rationale behind the Constitution of the United States was to replace a central government under the Articles which couldn't do anything, that had no power. It was totally dependent on the states and could not take independent action on its own, but rather was rendered dependent upon the states for military force, for finances, and all the rest of it. Government could not tax, could not do many of the things that government would need in order to become an independent force in American society. And the Constitution of the United States that Madison drafted was designed to reverse that. And Madison's argument and Hamilton's support for that argument was that individual liberty is not jeopardized by a more visible, more powerful government, but in fact is enhanced by it. And we were looking specifically in our last program, and I don't want to go back through all of this again, but I did want to touch it because it kind of brings all of us back to where we were the last time we were together, to looking at Alexander Hamilton's positions on this issue as written in Federalist number 70. And I think if you look at the very beginning of Federalist number 70, you will find that Hamilton is making very clear, definitive, positive statements about the extent to which a visible, aggressive government that is actually involved in governing is a vital necessity to good government. And the reason I say this is because we are still bombarded by rhetoric and literature which tries to argue just the opposite. Here in West Virginia, for example, let me give you just a local example from where I'm broadcasting right now. Our legislature has been in special session all last week and into this week as well. And the expenses of bringing the legislature together for this special session run in the area of $30,000 a day. And the issue on the table is an anticipated deficit here in West Virginia of something approaching $270 million. So the issues associated with addressing the deficit and passing a budget, a balanced budget, are focusing on tax increases on the one hand and cuts in government services on the other. The elimination of government jobs. In other words, cutting our way back to a balanced budget in the face of declining economic activity here in West Virginia, especially, of course, everybody points to the decline in coal production here as being the major culprit, but there are other things as well. And there's absolutely no question that our state economy is in very, very bad shape here in West Virginia. And one of the issues that has come up related to the idea of the balanced budget is the fact that 26 members of our legislature, not all of them Republicans, most of them Republicans, but not all of them, have signed Grover Norquist's pledge that under no circumstances whatever would they ever support an increase in taxes. And so basically one of the issues on the table here is the extent to which that pledge that these 26 candidates signed, is inhibiting the legislature from finding a solution to the state's deficit problem. Since more than 25% of the legislature, our legislature is comprised of 100 people, so more than 25% of our legislature has signed a pledge that they will never, under any circumstances, support a tax increase. Given the fact that the state is looking at a $270 million deficit hole to fill, that pretty much eliminates one whole side of the equation. And so while many people are talking about a mix, a balance of cuts on the one hand and tax increases on the other, the fact of the matter is getting any kind of a tax increase through this legislature is not going to be easy, because so many members of the legislature have already pledged that under no circumstances will they support a tax increase. Basically, then, what this means is that you are rendering government less able to govern and rendering government less adequate to provide the services to people who need those services the most. the unemployed, the untrained or undertrained, the undereducated, the disabled. And so basically, if you take tax increases off the table, then government has no other option in terms of passing a balanced budget, which is a constitutional requirement here in West Virginia, as it is in many other states. The only avenue open is to emasculate government, eliminate positions, eliminate teachers, cut firemen, cut state policemen, cut whole programs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Close state parks, do damage to the tourism industry here in West Virginia, when in fact it's the only industry left for all practical reasons. So in a sense, what this does is render government unable to govern. And we are right back into Hamilton's position in Federalist number 70. Is this good government or is this bad government? Is this good policy or is it bad policy? Is a government which finds it difficult, if not impossible, to pass anything, is that good or is that bad? Well, obviously conservatives argue that it's good and that individual freedom is enhanced. That in effect, every time government acts, it's to the detriment of somebody or some interest. That's the conservative position. Hamilton and Madison both take issue with that. And I really do believe that given what's happening in the nation right now, with this election coming up in the fall, it seems to me these issues are quite relevant. They remain quite relevant, and they require citizens to be much more aware of some of the issues, some of the things that are going on. In Federalist number 70, Alexander Hamilton opens in the very first paragraph, the very first sentence. There is an idea, he says, which is not without its advocates, that a vigorous executive is inconsistent with the genius of Republican government. Hamilton is dealing with those people at the time who were afraid of a strong executive branch, a strong president, for fear that a strong executive is contradictory to the idea of popular government, the idea of Republican government. And Hamilton devotes Federalist number 70 to refuting that view, that position. Hamilton says very basically, when he opens with that sentence, this, he says, is quite wrong. And this is the closing couple of sentences of the first paragraph of Federalist number 70. Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government, Hamilton says. It is essential to the protection of the community against foreign attack. It is not less essential to the steady administration of the laws, to the protection of property against those irregular and high-handed combinations which sometimes interrupt the ordinary course of justice, to the security of liberty against the enterprises and assaults of ambition, of faction, and of anarchy. Unquote. What Hamilton is referring to here are the real threats to individual freedom. The threats of the wealthy, the threats of factionalism, and the threat of anarchy. All of those things, Hamilton argues, threaten individual freedom. all of them require a strong, aggressive, energetic government in order to make sure that they don't get a foothold. Later in our program today, if not today, then definitely tomorrow, we're going to look at this issue of anarchy and the founders' fear of demagoguery. The founders fear that the greatest threat to law and order in a republic, in a popular government, is the demagogue, the leader who is able to come along and influence the masses to support that leader in order to fix all of the problems that a nation faces. There are some people who believe that this, better than anything else, explains the popularity of Donald Trump. That Donald Trump has been able to come along and manipulate the situation and use the media so effectively that he has effectively built the kind of mass following which is immune to attack and immune to challenge. The irony being that every attack on Donald Trump seems to validate the reason why we need Donald Trump. The implication that the only people attacking Donald Trump is the members of the current establishment, are those people who have been and want to continue to be in positions of power and influence, all of them threatened by Donald Trump. So the more there is attack against Donald Trump, the more the rationale for supporting Donald Trump seems to be is validated. And that was a major fear of the founders. The power of the demagogue to manipulate public opinion and manipulate the media in such a way that they would get people, the masses of people, the uninformed or the underinformed, to follow them. Hamilton goes on in the second paragraph in Federalist number 70 and says the following: a feeble executive implies a feeble execution of government. A feeble execution is but another phrase for a bad execution. And a government ill executed, whatever it may be in theory, must be in practice a bad government. What Hamilton is saying straight up, no questions, no equivocation at all, that a government that does not or cannot govern is bad. And all the things that are of value in this republic are dependent on good government, which is visible, active, efficient, effective government. So those people who attack it obviously are doing so, is quite the implication here, for their own personal agenda. That somehow they are in positions where a government that can't govern is a government that can't regulate them or regulate their behavior or interfere with them in any way, which to be practical is license to do what they want, when they want, however often they want. And there's nobody to stop them. because the agency that men created to stop them, government, has been rendered impotent. Hamilton devotes the entire Federalist Papers, 68, 69, and 70, to this issue of the need for and reason for a strong executive, a government that can govern, that can do things, that can regulate and plan and manage. To not do it is to surrender power to those who seek to escape government oversight and government regulation for their own best interests. It seems to me that particular document, and that particular document, Federalist Number 70, and these particular phrases, portions of it, constituted a major portion of our last program together here at the Virtual Center. And at the very end of our program, the last time we were together, we began to look at President Obama's commencement speech delivered at Rutgers University a week ago yesterday. Because in that speech, and I can remember we made a couple of general comments about it, but we ran out of time. In that speech, there was some criticism of President Obama's using a commencement speech to level political attacks against Republicans, and most specifically against Donald Trump. Many argued that while the attacks might be valid, a commencement address is not the appropriate place to make them. On the other hand, it was quite obvious that the Rutgers student body, the graduating class, as it were, seemed to relish the quality of President Obama's speech. What we were doing here at the Virtual Center was looking at some of the content of that speech. What I wanted to do most specifically was address a major theme of that speech, which, for lack of a better term, is usually defined as anti-intellectualism. And of course, when you raise the issue of anti-intellectualism in America, you are almost bound to go back to Richard Hofstadter's 1966 Pulitzer Prize winner, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, which is the definitive study, as it were, of the role that anti-intellectualism has played in American society. If this is a book that you have not read or have not consulted, I highly recommend it. In fact, to be very honest with you, I highly recommend most of what Richard Hofstadter has written. He was one of the most insightful, perceptive historians of American society, commentators on American society at large, that I think has ever been available here in this country. So if you'll bear with me, I'd like to share with you a couple of the most relevant quotes from President Obama's speech, and from there begin to look a little bit more substantively, a little bit more critically, as it were, at this issue of anti-intellectualism. The president made the following comments. If you were listening to today's political debate, the president said, you might wonder where this strain of anti-intellectualism came from. And then the president said, so class of 2016, let me be as clear as I can be. In politics, as in life, ignorance is not a virtue. Unquote. Of course, what the president is implying and saying here is that anti-intellectualism is ignorance. It is a defense of ignorance. To not know, to those who would challenge intellectualism, to not know is not a negative at all. In fact, it's a positive. And of course, the reality is that in a popular government as we have, as this republic is designed to be, an ignorant electorate is a gullible electorate. So by definition, the existence of anti-intellectualism in a popular government is very, very dangerous, because it renders large numbers of citizens vulnerable to the effective manipulation and maneuvering of demagogues, of self-motivated leaders who are able to use the media and use their positions of wealth and influence and power to manipulate large numbers of people to follow them, wherever following them might take you. The president says further in the speech, if the past 2 decades, the past 20 years, have taught us anything, it's that the biggest challenges we face cannot be solved in isolation. And this is where the president goes into clearly an attack on the America First isolationism that seems to be at the bottom of a lot of Donald Trump's positions on foreign policy. Obama made the comment that a wall cannot stop the rise of terrorism, nor can it stop disease, nor can it alleviate economic inequality. Obviously, the reference to the wall is a clear reference to a criticism of Donald Trump. President Obama says the point is to help ourselves, we have to get the help of others. And we have got to help others, not pull up the drawbridge and try to keep the world out. In other words, this idea, this image of building a wall around America and further isolating us from the rest of the world, the assumption being that if we keep the problems out, we have a better chance of solving the problems we have. The president's position is this is not going to work in an increasingly interconnected, interdependent world. He said a lot of folks have legitimate concerns about the way globalization has progressed. But he says the answer is to negotiate with other countries to raise their trade standards and their environmental standards, and to promote human rights that are consistent with American values. Building walls won't do that, President Obama said. It won't boost our economy, and it won't enhance our security either. Then he went into the issue of isolating or disparaging Muslims, Mexicans, foreign, illegal aliens, all of it. And this is where he made the comment that we opened with. If you were listening to today's political debate, you might wonder where the strain of anti-intellectualism came from. And then he said, ignorance is not a virtue. He closed by saying, it's not cool to not know what you're talking about. That's not keeping it real or telling it like it is. It's not challenging political correctness. It's just not knowing what you're talking about, unquote. And of course, the implication there is directly aimed at Donald Trump. When we signed off the last time here at the Virtual Center, I made a commitment that we would return when I came back after being on the road for a few days. We would revisit this issue of anti-intellectualism. We would revisit it by looking a little bit at Richard Hofstadter's contributions to the ideas of anti-intellectualism, and we would do all we can to try to get a working understanding of it for ourselves. So let's do that. Richard Hofstadter, in his book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, I think I said 1966 he won the Pulitzer Prize. It was 1964. This book won the Pulitzer Prize. And what Hofstadter focuses on in America's history and its development is the emergence of democracy, and especially the idea of democratization in education. The assumption being that the fastest route to being successful in a free society is a good education. And if American society is really going to make opportunity available for large numbers, the largest number of its people, if we really are going to democratize the nation, it's going to happen in our schools. It's going to happen through the expanse of public education. And this fact, this happening, the democratization of education, raised the issue within education of the difference between educational quality on the one hand and education's utility or usefulness on the other. The difference being that as American education became more available to more people, the approach to education began to change from high quality education to useful education, to the extent to which education was the ticket to a career, to a job. And we still have the debate in this nation as to whether the purpose of education is to get a job or to fully develop the potential of individuals, of the individual. And there's an assumption, an operative assumption, that there's tension between those two ideals. There's absolutely no question that useful education became the model or the definition for the education of the masses. You needed a degree in order to qualify for this job, for that job, for this career, for that career, or whatever. And so the assumption is that the education itself was not a goal in itself. It was not an end in itself. It was the means to a career, to a successful life. And once that sold, once that connection grabbed on, education in America became big business because it was something that everybody wanted, everybody believed they needed. Everybody was willing to go into debt to make sure that their kids had access to education. And the whole idea behind the American dream was that each generation promises a better standard of living or quality of life than the previous one. Now, as you know, we are in a stage or in a situation in this country where many people are beginning to question that assumption. Many people are beginning to raise the questions as to whether a college education is even worth it, and to rationalize the fact that there are plenty of good jobs out there that don't require 4 years of college or more, graduate school or something. That what is most necessary are skills. Skills that enable one to manage and master the workplace. And so basically the debate goes on between educational quality for its own sake on the one hand versus education for purposes of career entry on the other. Most of the education that the masses of the people receive is in the direction of utility, usefulness. If you go back through the history of education in America, you begin to see that the first prominent advocate of useful education in America was none other than Benjamin Franklin. Franklin's argument was that if education is going to become attractive to people, it's because it takes them somewhere. It delivers something to them. There's a payoff to it. And so the fact of the matter is, in many cases, the payoff becomes far more important than the process itself. To the point that we have become, many critics point out, that we have become a society that is hung up on credentials. Whether in fact we have a piece of paper, whether it's a degree, a diploma, a certificate of completion, whatever it might be, some evidence that we've gone through a particular educational process. Whether in fact we learned anything while going through that process becomes, in a lot of cases, a secondary concern. So we end up with the stories about people graduating from college who can't read, who multiple guess their way through college by shopping around and picking the classes where they don't have to write, they don't have to reveal themselves, they don't have to reveal their weaknesses and their vulnerabilities, but they can multiple guess and true and false their way to a degree, because all that matters is a degree. And from that comes the logical conclusion on the part of many that if I have the degree, society has an obligation to give me the job that goes with it. In other words, what we are facing now are large numbers of people in our society who have college degrees who are working at McDonald's, or the equivalent thereof, who can't get a job. The fact of the matter is, employers don't hire degrees, employers hire people. What the degree does is qualify you for consideration, but it doesn't guarantee you anything. In fact, the position that I used to take frequently with students, I would say basically, a degree guarantees you nothing. But lack of a degree does guarantee you something. It guarantees that you will not qualify for the positions or the careers or the fields you need. In other words, you have to get the degree in order to be considered. But once the process of being considered begins, it's you that the employer is hiring, not the degree you have. Everybody in the waiting room who's after that particular job has the degree. So the question is, what is there about you, about your education, that causes you to stand out and be superior to your competition? So again, what we're talking about here is the idea of education as a useful means toward a particular end. A critical piece, or the critical road, if you will, towards fulfillment of the American dream, if indeed there ever was such a thing. That began in America with Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin's I'm stuck for a word here. Contributions. Benjamin Franklin's contributions to what became the College of Philadelphia, which eventually becomes the University of Pennsylvania. And Franklin was directly involved in the creation of the College of Philadelphia. And the emergence of business, because Philadelphia was a growing merchant mecca for economic growth, commerce and trade and shipbuilding and banking and finance and insurance and all of that stuff. Franklin introduced all of these classes that we would call today components of, for lack of a better term, a business degree. And his argument is we can teach people the skills they need to earn a good living and move up faster. And of course, what that does is imply that education is not an end in itself. Rather, it is a means to some additional end, to some further end. Hofstadter, in his book Anti-Intellectualism in America, argues that the emergence or the growth of anti-intellectualism, which has always been there, is tied directly to this tension between educational quality on the one hand and education as a useful vehicle on the other. As America more and more valued education as a vehicle for the American dream, as a vehicle toward the good life, as more and more Americans were educated for careers, for getting a job, many of these people began to look down on education as something worth having for its own sake. They began to look negatively at the educated, at scholarship, at research, at those people who became well-read because they wanted to know, because it contributed to their understanding of the world and their ability to pursue truth. The more practical people believed education ought to be, the more negative they became against the educated, against the well-educated. They were looked upon increasingly as the elite, as the establishment, as the spoiled children of aristocrats, as arrogant, as people who believed that they had a right to look down on everybody else because they aimed at a life where they never had to work. They just received an education that seemed appropriate for the quality of life they planned to lead as members of the aristocracy, as people who were born into wealth and never had to work a day in their lives. And increasingly, people who worked hard began to look down on these people, thereby the emergence, the growth of anti-intellectualism. I've mentioned before on this program a thing that happened to me when I was in college, in my sophomore year, my second year of college. I was taking a required class in American literature. And the instructor of that class, knowing that the semester was not long enough to cover all of the literature in this humongous textbook we had, which was a collection, if you will, of some of the best in American literature, that for purposes of getting to the end, it was necessary to skip something. And what he chose to skip was transcendentalism, with the 18th century, early 18th century authors like Emerson and Thoreau and Hawthorne. And his rationale was these writers, these transcendental writers, were not really appropriate or apropos of what the American experience was about. Americans value practicality, usefulness, cost, the best product at the lowest price, efficiency, all the things that are associated with a market economy. And his position was that Emerson and Thoreau and Hawthorne and the others, contributing nothing to what American life and American society was really all about. Thoreau, for example, in his book, in Walden, in his study of Walden, went to live in the woods and to experience and appreciate nature. And for those of you who are familiar with it, you may recall that Thoreau's position was that real wealth, true wealth, is understanding what you can go and live life without. Not what you have, but rather to be able to identify what you don't need and what you can live life without. So in a sense, Thoreau and Emerson and the rest of them were challenging the very basis of an acquisitive, capitalist, profit-oriented society where people's priorities were jobs and income, where people assumed that one's quality of life had a dollar sign on it. And the only way to achieve quality in life was to be able to buy it. These people rejected that. They were critics of all the major elements, the major tenets of American free enterprise capitalism. And my English instructor decided that because they were critics and they contributed nothing to the society we live in, therefore, we students would lose nothing if we never read the Transcendentalists, never read Emerson, never read Thoreau, never read Hawthorne, etc. And that seems to me a product, the real tension of exactly what it is that we are talking about here. And so the fact of the matter is, I can remember in the 1960s, during the anti-war protests of the 1960s, on college campuses, growing up in Boston and hearing stories at work. I worked in a paper mill, in a factory, and hearing people sit around at night talking about these lazy kids, lazy rich kids, who are going to college, not looking for a job, but looking for prestige, looking for the praise that they get for the education that they have. They were the rich, spoiled children of the elite who didn't know what calloused hands were even about. I can remember hearing stories about friends of mine who worked in construction, who used to talk about working on high beams, on steel structures in buildings going up in downtown Boston. And they used to talk about the fact that during their lunch hour, they would bring a thermos bottle in their lunchbox. And they used to take pleasure in dumping coffee on kids protesting down below. And the irony of this was that many of these same people that used to talk about the spoiled children of the aristocracy and the elite, who wouldn't know a day's work if they fell over it, who didn't know how to cross the street to get to the other side. In other words, who had all the book learning, but when it came to practical things that one needed to know in order to survive in life, they knew nothing. In other words, criticizing the kind of education that they didn't have. But the irony was that many of these same people were working 2 and 3 jobs in order to send their own kids to college. I work with a number of people who had weekend jobs and second jobs in order to pay the tuition for their sons or their daughters who were enrolled at places like Boston College and Boston University. I didn't know anybody whose children went to Harvard at that time, but I knew a lot of people who had kids, Boston University, Boston College, Tufts, Brandeis, many of those institutions, some of the best institutions in the country, in and around Boston. These people would work 2 jobs so their own kids can go at the same time that they would criticize the elite who were the war protesters. Many of them, of course, got draft deferments and got out of going to Vietnam by going to college. And so you had the class issue built into this whole idea of anti-intellectualism, and the critics of the educated as being impractical and unable to do the most basic things in life. Let me be straight up here. There's no question that one of the key features of anti-intellectualism was the assumption that the well-educated, the highly educated, scholars, as it were, tended to be gay. And so the fact of the matter is, many people assumed that there was a direct connection between being gay and the kind of education you had. And so that prejudice against gays tended to be built into the anti-intellectualism that existed in America. It was a little bit more difficult to talk about than some of the other things, but it was a key factor. Hofstadter spends a lot of time in his book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, talking about the difference between intellect and intellectuals. Think about the term intellect. The intellect, Hofstadter says, refers to the critical, the creative, the contemplative side of mind. The kind of person who examines, ponders, wonders, theorizes, criticizes, questions, imagines, dreams. Those who advocated the more practical aspect of education always had difficulty with intellectuals, with people who led with their intellect. They viewed it as an education that was designed primarily to validate power and prestige. Intellectuals was seen as arrogant elite snobs, pretentious, conceited, snobbish, eccentric, and impractical. And that strain has gone all the way through America's intellectual development. There's absolutely no question that it's alive and well in our current political campaigns. There's no question that the base of Donald Trump's support comes from those who didn't graduate from high school or did graduate from high school and went no further. There's no question that the values, what some people refer to as the machismo, the macho, tough approach to life, appeals to the supporters of Donald Trump. Those who support Donald Trump supports him because he challenges the establishment. He refuses to play by the rules that the establishment writes. He's constantly in rebellion against the establishment. He says things that many people would love to say but don't believe that they can risk it. He challenges authority. He challenges power. He challenges big money. He challenges political power. And he challenges the intellectual community. There's nothing in Donald Trump's presentation anywhere that suggests even a hint of intellectualism. Of creativity, of imagining, of pondering. It's all based on practicality, on what's useful, on what works, and what doesn't work. This election is a classic illustration, case study in intellectualism. Richard Hofstadter would be doing handstands if he were alive today because of what this election campaign offers him in terms of the thesis that he put together in 1964. It is absolutely fantastic. You see it everywhere. The Donald goes out of his way to not be associated with intellectualism, not to be associated with intellectuals. Last week, he released a list of prospective Supreme Court nominees. Not one of them was from Ivy League schools. When the fact of the matter is, almost the entire Supreme Court, as it currently exists and as it has existed for the last several years and several presidencies, has been dominated by Ivy Leaguers, principally Harvard and Yale. None of Donald Trump's prospective nominees are Ivy League people. He's not going where the establishment has gone. He's not buying into what the establishment is selling. He's not going to cave to the Republican Party in uniting the party. He is demanding that the party come to him, that the establishment come to him, that those he's left along the wayside during the primaries come to him. At the same time, he's willing to acknowledge in speeches that he's been playing a role, that he's been playing a game, that he's pretending to be what the election seems to call for if he is to be successful and win the nomination. But at the same time, he's reassuring worried members of the Republican establishment that everything will be okay when it's not necessary to be presidential, or when it's necessary to become presidential, I'll become presidential. I can become anything I choose to be, providing that that's what the situation calls for. It is a classic example of the Americans' priority in its educational system. Practicality, usefulness, manipulation, effectiveness, goals and objectives, long-range planning, short-range planning, statistical measurements in order to determine or to prove success. All of these things are part of the practical approach to education which appeals to the masses. And part of what appeals to the masses is alienation towards the past, alienation towards the rest of the world, alienation toward everybody else except us, making America great again. As if at one time we were great, but now we're no longer great. And the implication is part of what's making us not great is our interaction and interdependency with the rest of the world. So damn it, we'll shut the rest of the world out and we'll build walls. We'll keep out Muslims. We'll keep out gays. We'll keep down women. We'll do, we'll keep out Mexicans. We'll do everything that reinforces the prejudices of the masses of people, because Donald Trump's ultimate goal is power. the ability to manipulate those behind him and convince them that he can do anything and solve anything. Therefore, he is committed to everything and nothing. There's no principle. There's no substance. It's easy for Republicans to convince themselves that Donald Trump can be their candidate because of positions he's taking, because he has supported or opposed everything. Therefore, he can become and will become anything that people want him to be. He's the ultimate chameleon. He's the ultimate clay figure. You can put that clay in your hands and you can make it into whatever you want. He'll be it. And if you need evidence, you can find a speech somewhere where he said he was for it, whatever it happens to be. And it's working. And it may be the thing the founders were frightened of most of all. James Madison in Federalist Number 10 talked about the dangers of the majority faction. An organized majority. And if you measure majorities and minorities on the basis of wealth, then the clear answer is that the majority are the poor. They're the ones who are getting the education to get a job, the certificates. They are the ones whose education has little depth. They are not the ones going to Ivy League schools and becoming creative and taking courses in creative writing and dreaming and imagining and philosophy and all of these other things. What life is about. What life ought to be about. These are the people who live practical lives because they have to. They're literally going from paycheck to paycheck, from week to week, from car to car. And they are the people that Donald Trump is enlisting in his army. It is exactly what Madison most feared in Federalist Number 10. The demagogue who would be able to activate the majority faction and get it to do whatever the demagogue chose or decided that it should do. They will follow him. It's impossible to criticize him because every criticism validates the justification for supporting him. In other words, if I need proof as to why I should support Donald Trump, all I need to do is listen to the people who criticize him. They're the people that I wish I could criticize. But I can't. He can. He's got the power and he's got the money and he doesn't need to be afraid of any of these people. It is anti-intellectualism gone mad. And let me make one further comment. I know we're heading towards the top of the hour and the end of our program today. I think we have about 4 or 5 minutes left. If there's one factor besides race that has made the road a tough one for Barack Obama, it's the fact that more than most of our recent presidents, he tends to be an intellectual. In his speeches, he fills them with philosophy, with history, with insights, with psychological images and psychological illusions. if you think back to the presidents that people like the most, who are they? Who are the ones that the masses of people seem to like the least? Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, who stumbles getting off airplanes. But who are the heroes in our presidency? George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, Harry Truman, haberdashery store in Kansas City to the White House. Let me remind you of a document that we hadn't looked at for a long time. It was a letter written to Andrew Carr in 1787 by Thomas Jefferson. And in that letter, and I know this will cause you to recall it, Jefferson made the distinction between the plowman and the professor. And his argument was that the plowman, the laborer, had a better chance of finding truth because the real direction, the real way to truth was to follow your gut, follow your instinct. Because God had put into every human being an understanding and a recognition of right and wrong. And the reason the professor was not the way to go is because the professor's road to truth, to right and wrong, is not a straight road because of all the intellectualizing that the professor has been exposed to. So Jefferson is also confirming the difference in education between one group of people and another group of people. And he's basically feeding the egos of the masses by telling them that they have a better chance of ending up in the right place and doing the right things by going with their guts, not going to college, not intellectualizing, not trying to become an intellectual. I really think that this stuff is important. I'd like to pursue it a little bit tomorrow if we could, but right now it seems to me our time is up. We're at 58 minutes after the hour, so we got to basically see about getting out of here so that the next program can begin on the Head On Radio Network. I want to thank you for being with us today. This is Bill O'Brien. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I want to thank you. Please have a wonderful evening. Enjoy it. Be safe. And we hope that you'll be able to join us again tomorrow. Thank you so very, very much.